Can you all hear me all right? Good, good. The first error I made on my way here was sitting down in a cafe to get my stuff together and work out what I was going to say and prepare everything, and then leaving my notes on the table when I left. But I'm going to skip through a few slides that cover lots of different things that relate to food, farming, supply chains, kind of nudging farmers along in terms of things like behavioural change. I'll talk a bit about some of the coalitions and partnerships that we've got where we're trying to work towards some of those sort of shared goals. And I'll talk a bit about what the NFU is in a moment. But I was looking through the attendance list today, which is pretty impressive, really. I see Ruth and lots of folks from organisations and farmers who are doing some cutting-edge, brilliant things. I thought, blimey, I'm going to look like a right imposter standing up here sort of talking about what good can look like when there are people in the room doing good already. But I think part of the point is that going back to the last comment about there are thousands and thousands of businesses, that's true for farming as well. We've got 44,000 members, and they are such a broad church of people in different geographical locations, doing different types of farming with different access and inputs into their sort of supply chain relationships, that everyone is sort of framed by the lens that they're looking through at their farm, making decisions that feel like the right thing for them, but often doing it in slightly different ways for slightly different reasons. And so bringing everybody together and kind of talking about where we can sort of get to collectively, I think is really important. So just a little bit about the NFU. So I guess a lot of you know the NFU. I know there's a few members in the room. We are sort of, I suppose we're the representative body of farming businesses, our members. I cover England and Wales. We work really closely with NFU Scotland, Ulster Farmers Union. We come together in our sort of shared Brussels office, as well as some of our sort of shared areas of work as well. But we are a trade association, so the things that we do and the democratic structures that we have and what we try to achieve is about sort of farming PLC, trying to improve the arena in which we all do business, as well as offering services and benefits and things like that. Sometimes there's a bit of confusion over the word union and what that kind of means and whether it's about individuals, but effectively it's collective stuff. And one of the challenges that we have is that a lot of the lobbying work we do, and this is the same for other lobbying organisations in the room as well, it kind of often, the shaping of policy is about making something a little bit less crap than it was about to be and rounding the edges of things. And that's quite a difficult sell when you're talking to a farmer and trying to say, I want you to voluntarily give me £1,000, £1,500, £500, whatever the subscription category is that they're in. But that's what we try to do, and that's what we aim to achieve. And I think the fact that we are so often able to get our voice heard in the corridors of power means that we do it pretty well, but it is a challenging area to work in, and particularly when we focus on things like profitability, farmer confidence. All of those things make it even harder for us to maintain our membership, but also for farmers to keep doing the things that we all want them to do around producing sustainably, working towards those shared goals, making the right investments in their business, taking that decision to go for that planning application and all those kinds of things. I'm going to keep looking around because I don't have my notes in front of me, so sorry about that. I'll talk a bit about domestic agriculture, how it's changing, talk a bit about government priorities, and there are some overlapping bits of policy happening at the moment. If you sort of imagine a Venn diagram of land use framework, profitability review, the food strategy, all these things sort of converge on a kind of sweet spot where I hope we could see farmers able to deliver for the environment, and I think there's some folks from the Environmental Farmers Group, and Josh is here. Hopefully we can deliver for the environment, for food, for biodiversity, for clean water, clean air. All the things we want to do should not be mutually exclusive, and that's the goal that we need to get to. And obviously working with our supply chains, and particularly the messages and signals that come down from those end user groups within the supply chain are really key. And as was said earlier, that's everything from Tesco to the sort of 1 or 2 person bands. And just to kind of encompass a bit of that, last week we held a hospitality sector roundtable in our London office, and we focused on the growth areas, how to work with sort of menu creators and chefs, and how we can gear up farmers to produce the things that people want to eat. And actually, it was really clear that in the out-of-home sector particularly, which is a huge part of the market, it's really hard to get people together to have a conversation about where we should be headed, because we, NFU's been really guilty of this. We focus too much on retailers because we can get 5 people in a room and talk about what good looks like and talk about how to support sustainable agriculture. So we definitely need to be doing more of that, and I'll cover that in a moment. I'll talk about a tiny bit about net zero. I think the net zero conversation is evolving to cover not just carbon, methane, all those things, but also to focus on other good things. And definitely biodiversity and clean air and water are right up there. Talk about fairness in the supply chain, because we can't do any of this if we're not getting fair prices, but also fair and transparent contracts as well. And confidence. We do a confidence survey each year, and spoiler alert, farmers don't feel very confident at the moment. And actually the last couple of years, that sort of feeling has built and built. And depending on what sector you're in and the kind of farming that you're doing, it's sort of plus or minus a little bit, but generally farmers are nervous about investing, they're nervous about what land use decisions to make over the years ahead. And obviously there's exceptions to those rules, and those at either end of the spectrum, but that's the sort of the general feeling and vibe that we get. So I'm going to start off with a little bit about sustainability reporting in supply chains. There are a number of factors that are influencing farmer decision making, but also the decisions of those within supply chains and what they're doing. It's really off-putting not having it in front of me to see. And so international directions, obligations and directions of travel are key. So that's all those agreements that are signed up to. COP26 led to a lot of those, and the kind of things that big businesses sort of need to sign up to, and then that sort of slowly filters its way down through the chain. National standards, net zero growth plans, all those kinds of things. So all of those have an influence in varying degrees down through the supply chain. Influential organisations and pressure groups and things like that are really important here too. And I sit on something called the Food and Drink Pact that used to be called the Courtauld Commitment, which is about reducing waste, food waste and waste from packaging and things as well. It's about reducing water wastage, all those kinds of things. Really like important stuff. We work really closely with organisations to help to drive that back through to our membership. Corporate objectives are really important, and I'll come on to those in a minute. Impacts on the supply chain. So actually, often, sustainability and decisions that relate to net zero are kind of no regrets actions. Very often, whether it's at a farm level or through the supply chain, taking that step has an impact on your business where you think, okay, maybe I'm producing something a bit different, or maybe I'm producing a bit less than I was before in some way, but actually that's improving my productivity, it's improving my profitability, and I should have done it years ago. So often that kind of conversation comes up. And then the impact at the farm gate. Again, depending on the sector you're in, if you're a dairy farmer, for example, who has quite a close relationship with their milk buyer, and they understand the pressures, and they understand, okay, we need to do this to try and get market share and to get onto the supermarket shelf. So that's why we're doing a climate check, or that's why we're doing, making sure we're using a greener energy tariff, or whatever it might be. All of those things, when they're communicated properly back through the chain, they do nudge change with the farmer, and particularly if there's a pence per litre incentive attached to it, as there often is in the dairy sector. But in other sectors, for example, growing cereals, the incentive might be to reduce your cost of production, but often the feeling that for the farmer is, well, yeah, but my product's being lumped in with everybody else's, and it's just a commodity at the end of the day, and maybe I don't have a relationship with my end buyer in the same way that that dairy farmer does, or the person in the integrated supply chain does. Now, there are exceptions to those rules, but often that's the kind of feeling that farmers have. I'm just a bit too disconnected to understand what it all means for me. So thinking about implementation, retailer compliance. So there's quite a focus making sure that any corporate objectives that are signed up to, any kind of pushes that come through that supply chain, specific and measurable, there's a clear objective, there's clear value to it. I've spent a lot of time recently talking to farmers about farm assurance and the reasons for it and debating the pros and cons and all those kinds of things. And actually, often it comes back to, can you communicate the value really clearly about why I should do this? And for farmers, that sometimes is the message that gets lost back through the chain. You want me to do net zero, okay, but why? What do I get from it? What does it mean for you? How does it secure my contract? What is all of this about? And I think that message gets lost a little bit down through the chain. The focus is often on greenhouse gas emissions, as I said before, but biodiversity is really important. Clean water is super important at the moment. And all these things are going to be the things that drive, I think, investment, money into the sector, and hopefully they'll have some impact on future environmental schemes, because some of you that follow the news will know that budgets are under pressure from government, and often that can lead to sort of quite rapid movement in terms of what's available, what's not, but really targeting where you can make a big difference is super important. So I mentioned the importance of corporate objectives in all of this. And one of the things that I've observed is that money really talks, and incentivize, oh God, I hope there's no sort of retailers in the room that I'm going to offend with any of this, but if there is, I sort of don't care. But there are often different ways to sort of deliver a challenge down through your network. You can say, right, we're going to work towards net zero, we're going to work towards reducing our impact, whatever it might be, whatever the measure is, and I want you to do it in a way that is cost neutral and delivers us some benefits that we can talk about. You could measure those in terms of like speed of success rate, working towards a sort of measurable objective, but often the things that get the change happening the most are relating them back to director bonuses, to the boardroom, to investors, because money really pushes this stuff through and brings that culture change. And I'm not going to name any sort of individual retailers, but I can definitely see those who have ownership structures where there are individuals who have proper skin in the game running a company and building those objectives into their sort of daily workload. They seem to deliver change faster than those where there are multiple investors, there are lots of people to keep pleased, that profitability is really important, or clobbering each other over market share is really important. And you could definitely see where those conversations play out and the difference it makes, just understanding the objective that an individual business is trying to hit. But there are some good examples up on the chart behind me. I know they're hard to see. The point is really so you don't have to look at me, but some of the stuff like Arla's work on climate check is really quite revolutionary. I know they're the biggest and ugliest show in town when it comes to the dairy sector, but as a cooperative, they're working really well with their members to sort of drive some of that data baselining, which is really important in all of this. We'll probably talk about greenhouse gas calculators and harmonising them and stuff like that later. But they're trying to make sure they can get their own baseline data from within their pool. And having seen some of it, it's really fascinating the differences between sort of UK farming, which is generally grass-based, lots of pasture-based stuff, and on an Arla contract you get bonuses for butter fats and proteins and things like that. Contrast it with their biggest milk pool, which is in Denmark, where most of the cows are housed and they have a different system. You would think maybe that the UK system would score really highly, but it doesn't score as highly in terms of efficiency, productivity, and climate checkpoints as the housed system does. But it probably offers other benefits in terms of that biodiversity, regen was mentioned earlier, all those kind of things that actually rely on livestock in a system. So there are lots of pros and cons about what you're trying to achieve, how you do it, and how you work it through the system. And other examples up there as well, McDonald's, Co-op, and things like that. So we launched, our last president, Minette Batters, launched a ambition to get towards net zero by 2040, or to get, not towards, that's playing it down, is it? To get to net zero by 2040. And I think it's going to be a challenging one to get to. There will be farms that get there will be some that don't. The ambition was for sort of UK Farming PLC, and I think broadly, you can say we're on track to make some huge steps forward to deliver lots of really good stuff, but we're probably not going to get quite to where we wanted to be. But the fact that the ambition was set out opened lots of doors for discussion. It set out where investment is required. It sort of gave a clear steer to government that we're serious about food production while reducing our impact at the same time. But for a lot of our farmers, just the language of net zero really turns them off. And I was talking to you earlier about how you kind of bring people along on the journey. Sometimes you just need to speak their language, and you need to talk about productivity gains, or you need to talk about cutting cost out of your business, or you need to talk about how you can reduce the number of inputs that you're using, for example. Those things resonate much more, and they just happen very often to work towards net zero as well. So it's kind of making sure you're speaking the right language, pulling the right levers, and understanding the market, the people that you're talking to, and how you get that change. Don't need to talk to you about that because you know all that already. But agriculture has I think, a pretty unique place in all of this. I mean, there's a reason that there are environmental farmers groups or clusters of sustainable farm networks and things like that, because there is an understanding that there is an asset there which is pretty useful. There's a role that farmers have in terms of connecting up corridors of biodiversity, or producing food, doing all the things that we want in terms of the core business of farming, and also those public goods that were talked about earlier. And we need to find a way to pull all that together to really talk about the good that we can do and what we can achieve. Net zero helps us to have that conversation, and it means that we use some of the same language that other sectors and other businesses are using, but it's not necessarily 100% like for like when we talk about what's achieved and how. Food security is really important in this debate as well. It'd be super easy to just say, well, you get farming to net zero by stopping farming, but the argument around, well, where do we get food from? How does it arrive here? What's the process that's being used when it's being grown or reared or whatever it might be? And I think also then factoring in, as was said earlier, food at every price point, sustainable food at every price point, access to British food where possible, all those kinds of things are really important as part of that multi-land use opportunity to deliver for food and for the land use framework as well. There are loads of examples of things that can be done within individual sectors. I know there are some folks here today who've got renewable energy schemes, they've maybe battery storage, things like that. There are lots of things that can be done and that farmers are trying to do. Often they're about diversifying the income rather than necessarily about working towards net zero, but if they have that impact and they bring the right kind of change, then that's brilliant. And I'll talk about some of the things farmers are investing in a moment or two. We've worked with our members, so we're led by a kind of democratic structure at the NFU. So anyone who's been involved in local authority, that kind of thing, I'd say it mirrors that pretty closely, where we have county-based management teams who are made up of branch chairs elected from our farming membership. We've got regional boards, sector boards, who then feed in through our kind of governance structure to ultimately to our council and our policy board, which is made up of farmers from every county across England and Wales. So every county, every sector. So that's the kind of the challenge we've got, where you've got sort of hundreds of farmers in a room and you're trying to get everyone to agree towards an action plan and things like that. But the best way we've found to bring people along is to really focus on the sector, to focus on the sectors building their own resilience plans. You can find these online, but it's about farmers coming up with the ideas for how I could reduce my impact, where I could reduce my impact. Are methane inhibitors a good thing that I could introduce into the diet of my dairy cows? Are precision farming techniques the thing that I need to focus on? What is it? Could I store water on behalf of my local water company to build a resilient network there? All the different things that can be done within a sector to work towards that efficiency. So we've worked on those priorities. They focus on a lot of the things you'd expect: energy, soil, inputs, all those kinds of things, but it's all really good stuff. Did I start a bit late, or have I just gone massively over time?
No, we were running a bit.
Good, that's cool. So I mentioned harmonisation on data. So a lot of farmers a few years ago were saying, why would I bother doing a greenhouse gas calculator? Why would I do a carbon calculator? They're all sort of measuring slightly different things. They're all working in different ways with a different kind of procedure behind them. There have been a lot of steps to harmonise those in the past. And I'd say to any farmer that's umming or erring about doing it, measuring something is better than measuring nothing. And at least you know to some extent where you stand, what you can achieve, how you can move forward. And particularly if you do the same thing over time, hopefully you'll see a difference and a benefit, and then you can kind of buy into it a little bit more. But we're still asking for increased harmonisation, and there is a DEFRA working group trying to do exactly that. Some of the calculators have started working together under the UK Food and Drink Pact and the Food Data Transparency Partnership. Sorry, there's loads of acronyms in this world, but I think you're all probably used to it. So there is some good stuff happening already. We're focusing over the sort of the year ahead. We've just submitted our response to the land use framework, and some of you probably saw that there was a big DEFRA consultation looking at land use. Effectively, it was kind of compartmentalising things a little bit. Forestry here, growing stuff here, cattle here, which is great to some extent, but I think there's a bit more nuance required in terms of all these things working together, delivering across multiple benefits across pieces of land, and hopefully we can work towards that over time. Those are our kind of key principles. I'm not going to run through it all, but effectively it's like a more agile, bespoke approach that works for the business and the land at the same time, rather than just, this is a green area, you do this here. I'll keep skipping through to get back on time a bit. So sustainability ask, I think you can probably work out a lot of them are about precision and productivity and boosting what we do and how we do it and doing it efficiently. There are some real big blockages, though, in terms of investing in the farm business. Planning is a massive one. There's a lot of demand for things like more poultry production, more horticultural production, trying to extend seasons with sheds and things like that. And depending on where you are in the world and who your planning authority is, that can be a really challenging thing to negotiate. Particularly if, I don't know, maybe your farm business doesn't have lots of succession lined up, or maybe there are other challenges at play around access to finance and things. And we're finding that these are real meaningful blockers, and they are directly impacting the purchasing decisions of retailers and other businesses, because they've got to make sure they've got a guaranteed supply coming through the system. Poultry is a really good example where we've got competing objectives, working towards reducing stocking densities for chickens in poultry meat production, reducing stocking densities, using slower growing breeds of bird, for example, all really good things to be doing, but they mean that you require more shed space or you require more inputs to be able to do it. And if you can't get through the planning system, then how do you comply? And often farmers are taking the hit, and they've reduced the number of birds they're producing into their supply chain in this particular example. And then we see retailers thinking, well, we're a bit short, so we'll have a look at Poland, or we'll have a look at the Netherlands or somewhere else and try and pick it up elsewhere, even though it's been produced in a way that's to the stocking density that we're moving away from in the UK. And that's one example where farmers feel like the decisions of the end buyer are really bashing their confidence, knocking the investments that they've been encouraged to make by their supply chain, but actually demand and other factors mean that we couldn't keep up with it. So that's just one live kind of challenge that's coming up. And the reason that I wanted to make sure confidence was such a key part of this presentation is that we have consecutively seen over the last 3 years farmer confidence dipping, and it's dipping because of changes to support payments. Area-based payments, as you know, are well and truly on their way out, depending on which part of the UK you're in. That's another issue around different structures of devolved decision-making around farming. But we're seeing farmers who are feeling that, actually, I don't have the incentives from my market to want to invest. I think I'll maybe look at something else instead. And some examples here. So farmers looking at investing in more renewable energy and energy storage, which is a brilliant thing, but they're doing it at the expense maybe of something else that they might have gone for, although hopefully it does free up a bit of cash and earn them a bit to invest in the farm business as well. profitability, farm profitability declines, that makes the farm a less attractive proposition for any next generation coming through the system. And I'm not going to talk about inheritance tax, but that's been a whole thing in farming. And so those are the kind of things that make the next generation of farmer think, well, maybe I'll just look elsewhere for a bit. Perhaps I'll come back, but I'm not quite sure. I'll hedge my bets. Maybe I won't go into the farm just yet. Obviously, it depends on lots of factors, scale and all that kind of thing. We found that different sectors feel differently towards confidence, and often actually dairy feels really confident because the levers are there quicker. You get, the milk tanker comes every other day, probably. You're getting a milk check every month. You get those signals from the market much more quickly than you do in other sectors where you're maybe growing beef cattle for a few years before eventually they're either going to a market, in which case you don't have a direct relationship with the next step, or they're going to a processor or whatever, and you're not getting that direct feedback, and you're not feeling that, I'm getting market signals to keep investing for the future. So I won't go through all of those, but they definitely have a huge impact. Now, finally, I wanted to stop on this slide. I know it's way too busy to see, and it's actually not my graphic. It belongs to DEFRA and IGD, the Institute of Grocery Distribution. So this is one of the output slides from a series of food strategy meetings. So the food strategy, so we've heard about Dimbleby earlier, and this, I think, is a kind of continuation of that process of designing a food strategy that works, hopefully, for the entire supply chain. But I've got a few, and I don't know if these are going to be controversial, depending on who's in the room, but a few thoughts really on where it's heading and how it's looking. And you can hopefully see there are some bolder words in there. So health, sustainability, food security, and economic growth. Those are the sort of four pillars that this strategy is resting on. And the intention is to focus initially particularly on health and economic growth, and then to sort of follow up with further recommendations around food security and sustainability. I think there's a feeling that actually this doesn't seem to, it seems to be trying to please everybody and may well please nobody. And so I'd encourage anyone who gets a chance to feed into the process, if you see DEFRA meetings advertised near you, and they've had them all around England, if you get a chance to feed into a consultation, do it. Talk about what's important to you, your business, your sector, because I think there's a danger that this strategy might look like something that is designed to unite government departments around food and drink, but not necessarily bring practitioners and people along on the journey. Health is really important, but if the goal is just to reduce burden on the NHS or something like that, then it's a good win, but it's not about an entire food system that, as we've already heard from the introduction, a food system that needs to be overhauled and to change. So if you get the chance, do feed in. I'm not going to kind of speculate anymore because I think we need to wait and see what comes out of the strategy, and we'll certainly be inputting as much information as possible on behalf of our members, but it just feels like the focus is maybe trying to cover so much ground that it's not going to quite focus in on quite the right stuff. So that's me. I'll leave it there if that's all right. I think questions in a moment.